All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, Section 4, The Collapse of Reconstruction. So while the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, 13, 14, and 15, brought dramatic political change in the aftermath of the Civil War, for most emancipated slaves, it was about building Black communities and using institutions to do so. During the antebellum period, recall that antebellum simply just refers to the time period before the Civil War. Marriages for slaves was not legally recognized. That even though slaves' marriages did actually exist, they weren't recognized legally, that gender roles more or less did not exist. That is to say that men and women were required essentially to perform slave labor. There was no distinction there. With emancipation, there was a very strong emphasis on family bonds. You did have marriage, which was legally recognized. And for many, it meant to, quote unquote, take to the road, which meant to look for lost family members. One of the most destabilizing aspects of slavery, and in fact, one of the most horrific aspects of slavery, was the fact when slave masters or slave owners sold family members, and that was used as a punitive measure to punish slaves in some cases, or in cases to threaten them. So to look for family members who had been sold. In some cases, people searched years and walked hundreds of miles in search of their family members. It meant to reinstate gender norms, that is to create a division of labor for men and women, which was previously denied in the antebellum period under slavery. So, family and culture was a big part, reclaiming those things which had been lost previously and denied to millions of people in the South was a critical part of building back communities in this post-Civil War period. In terms of economics, right, so sharecropping is going to refer to economics. You did have institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau, which had attempted to assist emancipated slaves to find jobs. The hope was that many of them would become wage laborers, much like their northern counterparts. However, the same type of industries, factory work, simply didn't exist in the South. The South mostly remained agrarian, and so the hope that emancipated slaves would work for wages in something like a factory, similar to northern counterparts, ended up not being the case. In fact, sharecropping was what most former slaves did for work. And a lot of this had to do with the problem of land, and we'll talk more about land and why that's important here. So during the Civil War itself, you did have some small-scale and local efforts to redistribute land. General Sherman, he was a Union general. And during the war, he gave 40 acres of land, and if you've heard of the term before, and a mule, to a limited number, we'll call them freedmen, that was the term used at the time, in South Carolina. And this was just one of kind of these smaller scale plans, you could say, to solve the issue of land. However, under President Johnson, any land that was claimed by former slaves essentially was reclaimed by whites. And so in the aftermath of the Civil War, we're talking mostly about a South in which the landowners, I mean, there might be very small exception to this, but for the most part, whites retained land ownership. And this part about land ownership here, the fact that it still belonged in the hands of many whites, plays a big role in the development of this system of sharecropping. And so what that meant was that many former slaves or many freedmen had to essentially work on the land of white landowners, and this gave rise to the sharecropping system. A system developed which is referred to as a crop lien system. This is a system which landowners provide credit as payment, right? So by working on someone else's land, the landowner provides that person with credit. And sharecropping is the type of system. Sharecropping is a type of crop lien system. So it essentially involves, we'll draw a white landowner here, and then we have essentially a freedman who was a former laborer here. And so the land belongs to the landowner. And essentially what the system allows for is that this person can work the land. They're responsible for growing a crop, right? Whatever that is. In this case, it's likely going to be cotton. But when the sharecropper grows whatever it is that they're growing, in most cases cotton, they have to share part of that with the landowner, right? That's how the system works. That's where the term sharecropping comes from. When you're done growing it, you share it with part of the landowner. However, it also created a cycle of debt, because in order to work this land, the sharecropper has to borrow money from the landowner. So we'll draw another arrow here going back, right? Actually, no, that's not the proper way of describing it. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit clearer. So in order to work on the land, right, the sharecropper has to borrow money from the landowner, right? So in this case, borrows money, we'll draw $2 signs, right? This is how it creates a cycle of debt in which the sharecropper can never get out. When the sharecropper grows their harvest, they give half, or they give part of it, they share it with the landowner. However, it is set up in such a way that no matter how much you grow, you are still always in the red. So you're never able to produce enough to get out of debt that was initially set up to begin with. And so this is a sort of cycle of debt, or maybe a form of debt slavery. And many former slaves found themselves in this situation following the Civil War and emancipation. Sharecropping isn't fully done away with until you have improvements in machines around the 1930s, 1940s. And so it's, in some ways it's similar to slavery in kind of the way that it creates a debt trap, so to speak. However, as Reconstruction continued to go on, the resistance to it intensified, and Reconstruction really becomes kind of a long, drawn-out battle of violent confrontation after violent confrontation after violent confrontation. There were many organizations. One such was the Ku Klux Klan, was originally founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, so he was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK for short. And initially, the KKK was set up as a fraternal organization for former Confederate soldiers, but quickly transformed itself into an organization to oppose Reconstruction, particularly the new rights that were enjoyed by blacks in the South. It utilized what we might call vigilante terrorism and violence. This could include anything from, murder to arson, really whatever means were necessary in order to roll back the changes that were brought about by Reconstruction. You see an image here showing a murder taking place by a member of the Klan. But it wasn't only African Americans that were targeted. African Americans and blacks were the main target of the KKK, but anybody who supported Reconstruction or Northern rule or Republican rule, whatever it referred to. This included people who were called carpetbaggers. These were Northerners who moved south for political positions. A carpetbag is actually a piece of luggage, right? So, the outside would be made of quote unquote carpet. So the idea is that you're a Northerner, you put all your things in a carpetbag, a piece of luggage, you move down to the south to take up some sort of political position. And this is obviously taking advantage of the fact that now you have, about 1 million new black voters, and none of the candidates in the South are they're not going to receive their votes. So these are people seeking political opportunities. This includes scalawags. Scalawags are Southerners who support Reconstruction. All right. And so whether or not it was African Americans, carpetbaggers, scalawags, these all were essentially in the crosshairs of organizations like the Klan. President Grant at the time and Congress responds by passing 2 laws: the Enforcement Acts or the Force Acts, and then the Ku Klux Klan Act. The Enforcement Acts essentially allow for the federal government to use stronger measures in order to pursue and deal with and prosecute members of the KKK. This was targeted specifically at what we might call, polling or maybe voter violence, specifically targeting the violence that took place at the voting booth, because that was one of the prime targets where the Klan would make their, carry out whatever tactics they did. The Ku Klux Klan Act allowed for martial law, which is essentially quote unquote military law. So that is to suspend what would normally be rights of citizens in order to deal with this organization, which was not abiding by the law to begin with. And so both of these tools meant that there could be a further crackdown on these type of terror activities. However, violence continued, and despite the best efforts by the federal government, by President Grant, by Congress to pass new laws to deal with the violence, there was a slow and steady pushback against Reconstruction. Those redeemers were those who wanted to free the South of Republican / Northern rule, began really to make political gains, and the Republican Party continued to decline, and there was a number of reasons as to why it was. They weren't entirely related to Reconstruction, but they had an effect on Reconstruction because the Republicans were the party of Reconstruction, the party of 13, 14, and 15, and making sure that there was a Union military presence to enforce those laws. You had an economic downturn in the 1870s. You had limited Republicans who advocated for smaller federal government. This is kind of the idea, government. The idea that a government that governs least governs best. And this had an effect on Reconstruction because a lot of what was being pushed forward by Reconstruction was being pushed by the federal government. So this wing of the Republican Party was chipping away at those who wanted more federal involvement. And lastly, scandal, and especially corruption. To a large degree, Grant. Sometimes this was called Grantism. We're entering into the Gilded Age, and that was a high point for political corruption. And because the Republicans were corrupt on other issues, right, not regarding Reconstruction, but on other issues, they really declined. And pretty soon, with the Redeemers, with these Democratic victories, you got to a point where in many of the southern states, the Democrats had wrestled control back from the Republicans. That is to say that it was put back into Southern control. violence continued. The Colfax Courthouse Massacre, pictured here, was one of the most infamous and deadliest instances of Reconstruction violence. And there you had 150 people killed at the Colfax Massacre, and this had to do with radical Reconstruction and especially Republican rule. This happened in Louisiana. And all of this came to a climax in the election of 1876. And you'd gotten to a point where, the Democratic Party had achieved a number of victories to take back political power in a number of states. You also had the Supreme Court limit the power of Reconstruction amendments and laws, right? So when we think about, the three branches in the federal government, we got a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And, the legislative supports Reconstruction. The executive supports Reconstruction under Grant. But the third branch, the judicial branch, is working to roll back a lot of the judicial branch interprets the law. So they're interpreting these amendments and interpreting these Reconstruction laws in a way that limits their effectiveness and limits their power. So it contributes to the retreat from Reconstruction. In this election in 1876, you have Rutherford B. Hayes. He is the Republican. He is the Northerner. All right, this is the supporting Reconstruction. And this is Samuel Tinian runs as the Democrat. He's actually from New York, but he really represents a lot of the Southern cause. And this election ends up having disputed returns, right? This is a map of the 1876 election, and you could see that at least for a number of these states in the South, that they've been redeemed by Democratic votes, right? Especially these ones in the former Confederacy here. It's not a perfect split between North and South, because you can see that Republicans still control some of these states down here. In fact, maybe let's grab a different color. The Republicans still control these states and, have most northern states anyways. Samuel Tilden's home state was New York, so that ended up going Democrat in this particular election. But regardless, the election was so close and the returns were disputed that it was looking like the United States might go to, another civil war. Civil War Part 2 was on the horizon, perhaps. And so the two candidates set up a special election commission, which would create a compromise solution to settle this problem. And what came out of the 1876 election, so this was created to solve the disputed 1876 election. And what came out of it was officially the ending of Reconstruction, because what the compromise allowed for was Hayes to be the president. Again, he is the Northerner. So the North got the presidency, right? So that was the short-term victory for the North. What the South got was a removal of federal troops. And really, without federal troops in the South to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that was effectively the end of Reconstruction.